Hello, this is Dr. Stephen Bueno here at Northampton Community College of Ethical Issues. This one will be on abortion, and we're going to frame this between personhood and autonomy, and I'll explain why and exactly how that'll work in a second. First of all, you never have to put your beliefs or your personal opinions on a shelf when you're doing a philosophical argument. But the distinction is with a philosophical argument, you are constrained by the principles of reason. So you could not quote some sacred text or a political party or anything else in support of what you've done. Although you can reason that those are true, you simply cannot use those as proof for the very stance that you're taking on a particular issue. So I just wanted to say that up front. A few other things to clear up is that there are various ways that people approach issues like this that are hot button topics. Some of them are not very conducive to having a conversation. Slogans are by their nature, if they're used as an argument, fallacious. In other words, they're fallacies. That doesn't mean that we can't use them. That just means that typically the slogan does not express exactly what the belief is. And it also gives the impression that there is some homogenous group that believes all along the same lines. So in this particular issue, we would hear things like pro-life or pro-choice. Pro-choice is a poor term because it is expressing a woman's right to choose, but it doesn't tell us what she's choosing and if that choice, with concerning her own body, extends to other things. We'll talk about that. Pro-life is not a good slogan because, as the argument I will try to show, this is not really about when life begins. And a person could be pro-life in terms of being against abortion, but perhaps not in some other areas, say immigration, perhaps death penalty and such. So we want to just put slogans to the side. The other thing is a political affiliation. Unfortunately, in the United States, this is very clear that those who are for a woman's right to choose, as they would frame reproductive liberties, is on the liberal or democratic political spectrum. And then those that are for the life of the unborn fall into the conservative or Republican. Again, it's unfortunate because then any divisions within our political affiliations spill over into everything else. So we're going to put those off to the side. An ideology is something that is a non-epistemic stance on something. So epistemology is how you know something. So you're not getting there by some reasoned argument which follows to a judgment. But it could just be because this is what my political party says, or this is what my religion says, or this is what the movement that I belong to says. So we're going to shelve those too. The last thing is, let's not pretend that this simply is just two sides, which the slogans tend to disorient us in that way. There are many people who believe that it could be a woman's right to choose, but not always. There are many people who believe that the unborn has a right to life, but there are instances where we have to consider other things besides just the life of the unborn. So let's just do our best to push all these things aside. And what I'm asking of you is, if you begin any post or you do anything else within this course on this issue or any issue that follows, you may say, I think. That's perfectly fine. But do your best to give a reasoned argument as to why you think. And try not to just do it from an authority. I think that it is wrong because the life of the unborn matters. That's not a good argument. I think that we shouldn't be talking about this because it's a woman's right to choose. That's not an argument. Those are just statements. So we're going to try to get a little bit deeper in here. Also, let's be very clear what exactly we mean by this. There are other abortions besides somebody who intentionally goes to try to terminate a fetal life. We might be calling them spontaneous abortions, or as they're typically known, we call them miscarriages. So if a person has a miscarriage, or if they have what would be like an incompatible, like say chemical pregnancy, it's very early on, the person may not even have known that they were pregnant. If it happens spontaneously, it's not an ethical issue, unless there was something else involved. The woman was abusing her body with alcohol or drugs, somebody else was harming her physically and caused the abortion, then there'd be culpability or guilt. But other than that, we're just going to leave it as it's just simply the intentional termination of the fetal life. One thing I did want to add was just to briefly address the concept of ensoulment. The text does offer some explanations on the issue, but I don't think, regardless of how one feels about this, that it's going to sway an individual one way or another. And to say that a human being has a soul is not simply a theistic point of view. Um, it's an immaterial aspect of soul, but there have been plenty of instances throughout cultures and time where people who do not hold a particular belief in a monotheistic God or such still believe in ensoulment. But we're just going to kind of leave that out. But I do want to say something. The text speaks of St. Thomas Aquinas, this early Catholic Church theologian and philosopher, as accepting ensoulment at quickening. So quickening is that point where the woman can actually feel some movement and such. So the word anima, which we understand from it means movement, but we understand it from the word animal. That's what the Latin term is for soul. So the text isn't really, in all honesty, presented correctly. So this is important for anybody that's going into the healthcare field. We didn't really understand how conception occurred probably until around the 17th century. The ancients, but Plato, Aristotle, all the way up through, thought that all the material for the child was contained in the semen. So the term semen is literally just Latin for seed. So the seed would be implanted into the fertile soil of the woman's womb. That may sound, odd to us, but it's how we plant things in the garden and such. So they had thought that perhaps that exactly is how procreation starts. So not a bad guess. But the point was finally identified at the moment or the time period, like when a woman felt this movement, this quickening. So it made sense. But once it was understood that spermatozoa, is within the seminal fluid, and there's some understanding of a living thing that becomes the child. It's like maybe like a parasitical notion, right? And also around this time, there was a discovery of the female egg. They didn't always understand what that was. And from the point on, in fact, even if you look in very early literature, they would call the ovaries female testicles. So they weren't quite certain how the reproductive system worked. So once they understood that this living thing had become a child, in the discovery of the female egg and such, and there was a movement from what was thought of like a generation to what we would now call procreation. These theories evolved. Evidence did not conclude until what we know now, until really the 19th century. So the point is, to say that Aquinas' method for determining ensoulment, that it was alive, and then now the beliefs change, that's really not an accurate portrayal. That would be what we call anachronistic. It's be like trying to say the solar system between Copernicus and Plato, that somehow Plato changed his mind. Copernicus changed his mind. No, they understood things differently. It would be like watching a movie from the 19th century with old English castles and see somebody wearing Nike shoes. You can't put those two things together. They don't fit. So just keep those in the back of your mind. A little bit of just brief, let's say, legal understanding of this is, without giving a full-blown history of it. In 1973, the landmark decision Roe v. Wade, this was Henry Wade. He was the Attorney General for the state of Texas. And Roe, who we now know was Norma McCorvey, at the time she had no idea that she was Roe, because you can't present a case to the courts unless you have some agent that you could at least, an acting agent that you can make the case on their behalf. You can't go to a court just with a theory. So they chose Norman McCorvey. The ruling was overturned that any state law prohibited abortions in the first trimester. So, there were other provisions, but it basically linked viability to potentiality. Judges aren't philosophers, or they probably would not have understood that, because what we have to understand with potential is that a potentiality is the power within the thing. So when I hold a pencil at 4 feet high, it has the potential to drop. If I let go, that's its only future. It's not like it's going to float. So to say that something is potential is not the same as saying it's possible, that type of thing. I won't go more into that, but keep that in the back of your head. On the same day, and this is one that is less familiar, Doe v. Bolton. This was over in Georgia. So Doe was Sandra Cano, who she also didn't know that the case was being filed on her behalf. In fact, she didn't find that out until 2003. But anyway, this was about the health cause, right? So when we hear terms of life of the mother, because this is such a controversial topic, let's be very clear that when we're talking about life of the mother, the average person hears that the woman will die. But that's not how the law is framed. It is the health of the mother, and it encompasses anything from the physical, but it could be her emotional health. She's not ready for another child. It could be her psychological. She's worried about the payment. It could be familial. I have other children at home. Or it could be her age. She's in her mid to late 30s and such. Now, I'm not dismissing any of those things as legitimate. It's just that typically when we hear the term life of the mother, we don't realize that it's that encompassing. So let's just be clear that we're talking about that when we meet, when we're within this discussion. It's going to help. Real quick about rape and incest, because you'll hear some people say, well, I am, against abortion except in cases of rape or incest, and if somebody is for abortion, then they'll be questioned, well, how do you feel about rape or incest? Philosophically, incest has nothing to do with this. Rape does. So rape is non-consensual sex. You can have consensual sex between two adults who are in close, sanguinity to each other. In other words, they're blood relation. If it's consensual, then what would somebody's issue be with it? Somebody might say, well, but they can have children that have, genetic deformities and such. Well, they don't have to have children. I mean, 2 men, 2 women don't have children. It's only meant to add fuel to the fire, right? So if somebody can make an argument that there's incest that applies to the abortion issue that doesn't include rape, then we'd have to hear it. But again, just something else to keep in the back of your mind. According to the Alan Guttmacher Institute and WHO, the World Health Organization, Alan Guttmacher was a past president of Planned Parenthood, and they collect a lot of statistics on pregnancies, contraception abuse, abortions, and other aspects. You would understand this through Planned Parenthood. So according to the World Health Organization, there's 73.3 million induced abortions annually worldwide. Now, that's a large number. So it gives a scope of the issue that this is worth discussing. And when you have any numbers of that many of something happening, right, and we're going to try to explain how we work through this, it's worth delving into. Within the United States, there are, just over 125,000 per year that occur. I don't know what that comes out to anymore per day, but it's probably around 3,300, 3,400 or something like that. When people are given reasons for why they have abortions, the majority of them have some interference either with their education, their work, or their lifestyle. So the extreme issues, rape and incest, or underage, they're not that they're not important, because they are, but they're very minority cases, which means that they're not the reasons why people agree or disagree. So they come up because they make really good little hammers to get your point across, regardless of which side you're on. But this is the scope of the issue. Many abortions worldwide, people might die from because of unsafe conditions. In the United States, I think the last statistic that was read, maybe like 2017, 2018, there might have only been 1 or 2 deaths from abortion. So it's for the mother, it's a safe procedure in the United States. What we're going to focus on is personhood. And I want to try to explain what that is real briefly, but we can't do that unless we talk about the other 2 terms. So in the abortion, you have to deal with life, human, and personhood. We usually just tell whether or not we're for it or against it. We don't typically work through these things. When we say that something is alive, and like in other words, when we say with an abortion, when does life begin? Life doesn't begin. Life is a propagation. It's a continuation of something. For instance, a sperm and an ovum are alive by whatever definitions that we would use in some biological sense. There's homeostasis, there's cell division. I won't go through, the whole definition, but there's, big features for capacity, for growth, and there's stimuli response and such. So they are alive, they don't die and then come back alive some other time. The gametic material is joined, and that itself forms an oocyte embryo, whichever you want to refer to, in the early stages of development. So life comes from life. To say we don't know when life begins is not being clear on that term. So if you are for a woman's right to choose and you say that life begins at conception, this doesn't change your argument. If you are against abortion and you say life begins at conception, it doesn't win your argument. This is why these slogans don't work. We also can't say that it is anything but human. What else is it? In other words, it's not going to be a giraffe, and if it's a human ovum and it's a human sperm, we already have two human gametic material that are joining, and what we have is a human life. So again, human life begins at conception, and that does not end this debate for either side. We have been arguing about the wrong things too much. So what we have to get to, and this is the reason why we simply can't just hold a position and dismiss the other side as if they're not being ethical or thinking about this. Because in all of reality, this new human life has to be determined what the thing is. In other words, that is the field in philosophy of ontology. It's being. We cannot make a determination on anything until we say what the thing is. If I were to say to you, behind this curtain is a living being and I would like to kill it, may I do so? It's your call. And you can't ask why. It's just that you're going to say yes or no. Well, you're going to want to know what it is. Because if we don't know what it is, then we have to make some decisions, perhaps even be on the safe side. Aesthetics has something to do with this. Because if I were to tell you on the other side of this curtain is a cockroach, nobody I know would care. They would say, by all means, step on it. If I were to tell you it's a rat, okay, my family, my daughters had rats. They're much better pets than gerbils and hamsters and such. But, you know, we typically think of like the sewer rat, and we set out rat traps, so perhaps nobody would have a problem with that. If I were to say it's a little kitten on the other side of the curtain, people would, rightfully so, think that there's something, obviously wrong, that why would you want to kill a little kitten? If we say it's the born or the unborn, we're going to have to say what this born or unborn is. So for us to this concede on all not sides, but in all aspects of the spectrum in the abortion debate, that it is a human life, we just do not yet know whether or not we're going to consider it a person. That is really the only argument we're talking about. The legality of personhood is at birth, but we're not here to argue the legal aspects of this. We're here trying to figure out philosophically exactly when we might have at least the understanding of when personhood might begin. These are just some of the hallmark positions that a person could take. A person could say, well, I believe that there is no such thing as any human life that is not a person. Well, then that would put you in the case where you would be opposed to abortion because you would believe that human life and personhood are attributed at fertilization. The heartbeat. In Texas, there's a law going out right now that was not heard by the United States Supreme Court. A lot of times these bills are known as heartbeat bills. So around 6 weeks of age, the fetal heartbeat is audibly sensible. So does that mean that now we have a person? Brain activity. This can span various gestational ages. Or movement, remember quickening. So once you feel the unborn, the fetus moving within the womb, now is it a person? A pain sensitivity, because it may be that there are certain neurons in place that we can say lead to the understanding that this unborn would feel pain. Others would say no, but there's nothing that's quite developed yet that they can feel that until a certain age. Nonetheless, that's another concern. Viability is when this unborn would be able to perhaps at least have a fair chance of survival outside of the womb, 22 to 24 weeks. The reality, though, is that if you're going to call personhood a viability, then you would be one of those that would say, I only accept abortions in the first 2 trimesters, not in the 3rd trimester. And that's a legitimate position for many people. But what they don't think is that they're attributing personhood to viability, and it's probably because of aesthetics. because at this point you have a little unborn fetus that, even though it is still small, it has the features of what we would consider to be a born child, post-uterine. Birth is the legal aspect, and where this would at least work with autonomy is that the child is outside of the mother's womb. So it's an easy mark for somebody to say that's when personhood begins. And in the United States, it's when the actual head, not the legs or the arm or the torso, but when the head actually evacuates the vaginal cavity. Philosophers don't like that, though. Some philosophers, like Peter Singer of Princeton University, will talk about self-awareness. In other words, it is not a person until they know that they are separate from the world. In other words, it could be that a person in a permanent vegetative state no longer knows who they were, and some people are comfortable with perhaps even passive euthanizing them. Literally, in some countries, it would be warranted, at least not warranted, but it would at least be allowed under certain conditions. So individuals like Peter Singer say this does not happen around to 5 months of age, at least, perhaps 6. So we do not have a person at fertilization, heartbeat, any of those, viability or birth, but not until the child is self-aware. Now what that means is that an individual would be able to have infanticide. Now I know that's illegal, but we're not here discussing that. Now that takes people back a little bit. Why would somebody say something like that? But you see, he's very clear in his philosophical explanation that if personhood is only for an individual who knows that they are separate from the world and that they exist, then they're not a person up until that point, and any time before that, or any time when they would lose that self-awareness, they would also lose their personhood. So these are some of the considerations that you're going to have regardless of your particular bent on this. On the other direction, when we start talking bodily autonomy, here we're saying that the woman has sovereignty over her own body. And because the child is at least using her body in gestation, we can argue whether or not we would literally call it a part. In many ways it is a part. But we would have to here question, are there any limits to self-governance? In other words, forget about just women. Do either males or females have total sovereignty over their bodies? We do not. We could not sell organs. We could not even give ourselves in martyrdom to give our heart to somebody that we would perhaps want them to have it, a child or such. We can't self-harm, and there are other things. So how this has to be balanced with personhood is that a woman does have the right to her bodily autonomy. So an individual who would be, and I'm going to use these because it's easier, a person on the pro-life side who says that personhood begins at fertilization has to recognize that a woman has certain rights to her own bodily autonomy. A person on the pro-choice side, again, don't like the phrase, who supports bodily autonomy is going to have to realize that their bodily autonomy stops at the threshold of another person's personhood. So this is why we have to have some view of the ontology, what this thing is. Because if it turns out that anything prior to birth, there is personhood, then a woman's bodily autonomy would stop because it stops at the threshold of another person. Now, there is this right to refuse argument that comes from Judith Jarvis Thompson. So I won't build the whole schematic of what she said, but she talked about whether or not somebody was abducted off the street and placed in the bed next to an individual, a famous violinist, who you had to be hooked up to them because of their fatal kidney element, and it wouldn't cost you anything, but if you can simply stay there for 9 months, then the famous violinist would be perfectly fine. If you left before that, the famous violinist would then die. So Judith Jarvis Thompson's argument is, do you have any duty to be hooked up, almost maintaining the other person's life? Now, that's an interesting thought experiment. The kickback on that would be is, is the mother's relationship to an unborn child the same as that as a famous violinist to a stranger who was abducted? In other words, there is no other way for this unborn to come to life except through the mother's womb. But she's trying to at least play with the area as to where are the limits for this, and does a woman have a right to refuse this? So you can make what you want out of that. I want to just mention something about this, because back to the life of the mother issue, and that comes up often. It might be a false dichotomy to say that simply because there's a difficult pregnancy that the mother's life is threatened, therefore an abortion is necessary. There are going to be instances where it's in like ectopic pregnancies, which would not come to fruition. If the embryo implanted into the fallopian tube, which is mostly what it is, something extrauterine. But it could also implant, say, into the pouch between the anal, vaginal pouch and such, where it's unlikely it's going to grow in the abdomen like that, and this could be dangerous for the mother. The issues of hypertension and such. There's something that's called expectant care. In other words, most people, unless you are full out bodily autonomy, would not want to see a woman have an abortion simply because she feels that it's going to make her unattractive throughout summer. Somebody would perhaps not be so hesitant if they knew that this pregnancy could place her health in, let's say, she has such serious hypertension that the chances of her having a healthy pregnancy and then delivery at a term when the child can be viable. In other words, it's unlikely that both will be able to make it, so some decision has to be made. I'm speaking very generally here because you would need a specific case. So that's called expectant care, that you're doing your best to move both patients along, because in a prenatal, the unborn, whether or not the hospital considers it a person, which is not their competency, they're treating the unborn of the mother when she goes in for care just like they're treating the mother. The principle of double effect is when you have to do something and what you're going to do is going to have a bad effect that you don't intend, but you have no choice. So if a woman did have an ectopic pregnancy, let's say in the fallopian tube, and in order to preserve the fallopian tube, the unborn was surgically removed, that would obviously result in the death of the embryo. But the life of the mother, which is in proportion to the death of the embryo, is worth it. You don't intend to kill the unborn. It will not come to fruition, and there's no other way to do this. So what you do is a surgical procedure that preserves the life of the mother, where you are fully understanding and anticipate the death of the unborn. But because of the proportion and because of the non-intention, even those that perhaps say are on the so-called pro-life side would not have an issue with this. So we have to be careful, again, that there's a lot of nuances here. What I want you to do is I want you to determine an ethical system. If you believe it's a woman's right to choose, or if you believe that abortion is wrong, why do you believe those things? And without summoning just an ideology, a political affiliation, or even a religious system, what ethical system are you using? Is it utilitarian? Is it Kantian? In other words, if it's utilitarian, you're probably not going to have an issue with it, because it's only what in the end matters. As long as the woman is happy, her husband's happy, or whatever the relationship is with the people in their lives are happy, then the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Immanuel Kant would look for some categorical imperative and then try to associate that. Virtue theory would come up with something. John Rawls would look at justice. We can just go down the line. But you have to be consistent. And most people don't think through this. They tell you what they think or believe, but they don't do very well at getting to it without repeating themselves. I'm against abortion because life begins at conception. Well, you're going to need to construct that argument. I am for abortion because it's a woman's right to choose. Well, you're going to have to construct that argument. And then be consistent. And by that I mean that whatever your determination is of personhood is going to have to work at the end of life issues too. And for the other people, whatever your determination of personhood, it goes for people that are alive also. So these are just some things to think about. They're not exactly the enough material, which this deserves much more time, but I hope that at least gave you something that you can work through. And regardless of what your positions are, do your best to, let's say, determine how those judgments hold up, and then perhaps articulate your position better. Thanks for listening.